Hello, I'm Ailsa, and this is the Hanging by a Thread podcast. Welcome. Today I'm bringing something new and something that I hope will be a series. I'm calling this the Well Worn series. And the idea here is that I'm going to share my thoughts on a garment that I've had off the needles for a while. This is not a freshly finished object. It's something I've had over the longer term. And so I've had the chance to really wear it in, to understand how it fits in my wardrobe, to understand how the fabric is performing, to think about, the pattern overall. So to give you a bit more of a, I guess, educated or detailed insight into how this finished object has actually fit into my wardrobe and what my thoughts are on it after actually having worn it for a substantial amount of time. So, like I said, this I'm hoping is going to be a series where I go through some of my older knits and bring them back. I've spoken before about my inspiration for this. One of the biggest inspirations is Sherry over at Good Knits. She has these seasonal videos, which I will link to below, where she kind of looks back on her previous season's makes. Also, Mel at String Things by Mel has done performance reviews. So this is very much inspired by those creators. So I just want to shout out that this is not like some amazing idea like that sprang fully formed from my head, very inspired by those other makers. But what I really value about those videos and what feels really key to me about doing this kind of content is we can be so focused on the shiny new thing and like that's just kind of human nature, right? But I think when we think about slow fashion, when we think about sustainability, when we think about, trying to get out of the overconsumption kind of culture that we live in, revisiting older garments helps remind us, like, one, what do we have in our wardrobe already? And two, like, how is it performing? It can help us think about intentionality moving forward. If we think about, okay, that thing I made, like, how did it actually work for me? Like, how is it actually fitting into my wardrobe? It can help us make more intentional choices in the future. So there's a lot of reasons I love this style of video and why I'm really excited to bring it to the channel. So today, we are going to be talking about the Lento sweater. So for those of you who do not know, the Lento sweater is a pattern by Jonna Heelan. It was originally published in Line magazine, issue 11. And it went through a phase of major popularity. There was a cowl that was run around it. It seemed like every podcaster and their dog was making one. It just had a moment. And that moment happened to coincide with when I was first coming back, not coming back to knitting, but I'd been kind of only like very like sporadically knitting for a few years. And the Lento hype coincided with me coming back to knitting in a more intense way, let's put it that way. So it was something that was on my radar immediately as I started getting into knitting social media, knitting YouTube. I was seeing it everywhere and I was very excited. And I hadn't made an adult garment in like a number of years at that point in time. So we're talking about early 2023, so like January, February 2023. I hadn't made an adult garment since like maybe 2018. I'd made hats, I'd made cowls, I'd made baby garments, but I hadn't made anything for an adult in a really long time. And I hadn't ever made that many garments either. That just hadn't been my thing as a knitter previously. Okay, so that like context given, more about the pattern. So if you haven't seen this pattern before, it is a raglan sweater. And its kind of claim to fame is that it's knitted using a DK combination. So a fluffy yarn, a mohair or a surrey, and lace weight plus a fingering. And even though it's knitted at that DK gauge, or the yarn that you're using is that DK weight combination, is knitted at a very open gauge. So the suggested gauge for the pattern is 15 stitches and 21 rows. And it suggests using 6mm needles, so US 10 needles, in order to get that gauge. So much bigger needles than you would typically use for a DK weight garment, which therefore means you're going to have a really open, airy fabric. And also it's going to be really quick to knit because it's on that big gauge. So the pattern comes in 9 sizes, 1 through 9. It has a recommended ease of about 5 inches, and the finished bust circumference is 38.5 inches through to 67.25 inches, and 96 centimeters through to 168 centimeters. Its recommended ease, I think I said this already, but I'll say it again, is 5 inches or to 12.5 centimeters of positive ease. One of the other things that's really fun about this sweater is because you're knitting it at that open gauge, you don't have to use as much yarn. So for myself, I'm able to use under 2 skeins, 50 grams of lace weight. Not under 2 skeins. I'm able to use around 2 skeins, maybe breaking into a third, to knit this sweater in the size 4. So I made the size 4, which is roughly a 48-inch bust circumference. So you're able to get a sweater with relatively less yarn than you would if you were knitting it at a tighter gauge. So for me, that meant I was more willing to play with some indie dyed, hand dyed yarn because I wasn't having to buy as much of that yarn. So that's another thing to know about this. I have actually made the Lento sweater twice. So I made my first one in the spring of 2023, and I don't have that one with me today. And so I'm not going to be talking about that one too much, but just to say, like, it was a fun knit to get back into garment knitting for an adult because it was so fast to make. I think I made it in 21 days. So it gave me that sense of achievement and I can do this. But, and we'll maybe get into this later, there were some pretty big mistakes in that one. Like I said, it'd been a long time since I made an adult garment. My knitting skills were a bit ropey. So even though I love that one, it's not like my best work. And then the one I'm going to show you today, I made in the fall of 2023. So I made this one. I started it on September 8th, 2023, and I finished it on October 28th, 2023. So it took me a little bit longer, but I probably wasn't working on it quite as monogamously. And I've had it in my wardrobe now for over a year at this point. So I have some really good experience of wearing it and getting use out of it and all of those things. So let me show you the sweater. I have it here on a hanger. Da, 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 da. Okay, so this is knit using, I used Knitting for Olive Merino as my fingering weight yarn in the color Marzipan, and that's just like a very neutral, creamy color. And then my Surrey was Sorella Yarn Surrey Lace in the colorway Savoir. So that's the variegated, which if you can see here, it's kind of pinks and purples and baby blues all kind of melding together. So yeah, that's where all of the color comes from. And that's what's giving the main effect. I did alternate skeins on the Surrey, and this isn't showing up so well on the camera, so I will share some photos of me wearing it, and maybe some b-roll. I'll see what I get to in editing, but I have some nice finished object photos that hopefully will be up on the screen here somewhere. So yes, I did make some modifications to this version that are different from my first version, and that that I'll go through here just to kind of give you the background. So this one, instead of doing knit front back increases, I did make one right, make one left. And I did a 2-stitch raglan rather than a 1-stitch raglan, just to have it look a little bit different to my original one. I did, and let's see if we can show this. I did a garter bump faux seam down the sides just for a little bit of extra interest. I just wanted to see how I felt about it. So that's just like a little extra thing I added in to give it some more detailing down the sides. I did Italian bind off for all the hems and cuffs. And I knit the ribbing inside out in order to make it look neater. One thing to know is that I started, my unblocked gauge on this sweater was 16 stitches and 23 rows. And my blocked gauge was 15.5 by 20 rows. So my gauge was a little bit off, but not by enough that it really bothered me. The other thing to know is that this grew a ton in blocking. I think one of the things I learned in this project is that suri, because it's that alpaca, it's so drapey, it grows a lot. And it changed the shape of my sweater a lot. So before it was blocked, the sleeves were shorter, it was a bit wider. The blocking made it kind of like, yeah, it changed the shape. That's what I'll say. So I ended up, I didn't, and everything opened up. So you can see here, even now, the neckline is quite wide. This is after I added in elastic. You can see here, I threaded elastic in. So this wide neckline is after adding in elastic. So, and I think it has stretched out more with wear. So that's another thing to notice. It looked a little bit better when I had the elastic originally put in, but it has stretched out over time. So that's, I guess, part of its wearability, which we'll get to. Okay, that is the history of the garment. Let's now talk about reviewing it and talking about how it's worked out over the year that I've had it in my wardrobe. So I'm going to go through, I guess, 3 stages of this. I wanted to be organized about this. So the first thing I want to think about is the wearability of the garment. Do I wear this garment? Does it fit me well? Does it fit into my wardrobe? How do I tend to style it? What changes would I make and why? And would I knit another? The second aspect I want to look at is how is the yarn, the fabric, holding up 1 year in? And how do I feel about this color, fabric, etc. At this point in time? And then my final thoughts of, would I knit this pattern again? And do I recommend this pattern to you? So that's kind of the framework I'm going to try and use in all of the Well-Worn series. Okay, so wearability. Does this pattern fit well? I just started talking about this. There are some issues with the fit that I have with this sweater. So overall, I like the way this looks on me. It's got an oversized, kind of slouchy look. The intention of the sweater, if you look at the pattern photos, is very much for it to be a cropped, slightly oversized fit. So I think I achieved that. I think what I learned with this sweater though, and actually I probably didn't learn it with this one. I learned it a little bit later on after some other sweaters I made. It's too cropped for me. And I did add length to this. I'm 5'8", so I pretty much always have to add length to sweaters, but I didn't add enough. So for me, it sits just a little bit too close to my waist. And I'd prefer it to just be like slightly below my belly button, not at my belly button. So that's one thing. So that makes It means that, you know, I wear it and sometimes I feel a little bit uncomfortable. Like if I need to stretch up, I'm worried about my belly showing, or I feel like it doesn't like quite sit right on me. Not enough to stop me from wearing it. And I think for some people, it would be absolutely fine where it is. It's just my preference is for a slightly less cropped look. The sleeve length at first, when I first got it off the blocking mats, I was really worried about the sleeve length. It felt so long. But actually, I realized I quite like that longer length as I've worn it over time. The neckline is quite wide, and I wish it were a little bit closer. Like I said, the neckline has stretched out over time. I could go back in and redo the elastic and try and like cinch it in again, but I don't know that I honestly have the desire to do that. Maybe at some point. Yeah, maybe at some point I will, but right now I don't have that desire. So, you know, that's a thing that over time I have seen a big difference in how that neckline looks. And I guess what that means is, to me, the look of this at this stage, it's quite a casual look, which maybe was always going to be the case because it's that oversized fit, because it's like that open gauge. But it doesn't have like a polished air to it, is what I will say. So in terms of how it fits in my wardrobe, I would say I tend to wear this over leggings. I don't think I've ever worn it with a dress or a skirt, though I think I probably could. But I think like mostly when I tend to wear it is over leggings. So like it's like around the house or like casually running errands. That's kind of the vibe it has for me. Yeah. So I think that's like mostly when I tend to wear it, which is not to say that I don't wear it a lot. I'm often wearing leggings. I'm often doing kind of casual things. I am a stay-at-home parent, and when I do work, I work from home. So I have a lot of occasion to wear, you know, something more casual and over leggings. The other thing I'll say is it's interesting with this fabric because it is so light, like you can see. It's so light, it's so drapey. But it is also quite warm. That suri, despite it having this open gauge, that suri really fills in and makes it quite warm. So sometimes I find I get a little bit too hot in it in my house because, you know, we've got the heat on. So it's not something that I tend to go for in the early part of fall or the late end of spring. So it really is a late fall, winter, very early spring garment for me. So that's kind of where its seasons sit. So, but I mean, it's good. Having a cozy but light sweater, I'm not knocking that. That is a positive for me. So that is something to note, though, that I think originally, especially when I made my my green lento, which again, I hopefully will have put a picture in here, or if I haven't already, I'll put it now. When I made my green lento, I was like, oh, because it's so open and light, it will be like one that I could wear, you know, more transitionally. But that didn't end up being the case. I realized that it's much warmer than I anticipated. So that was just partly about me learning the way that this fabric was going to behave and these fibers were going to behave. What changes would I make and why? We've touched on this a little bit already. So the first one is I would knit it longer, and that's just personal preference. I would like to have it sit at a different place on my body. I do have the yarn still. I could theoretically go back in and add an inch. I'm not going to. I don't want to undo my Italian bind off. I don't want to do sweater surgery. I'm not so unhappy with it that I am going to go and put myself through that. So that's not something I'm going to do. But if I were knitting one of these again, I would make that change. The other thing that and I don't know that I would really change this per se, and I'm just trying to look and see if I can find anywhere to show you. Well, I don't know, maybe I'll have to take some photos to show you and put those up on screen to illustrate what I'm saying. One thing that I want to know about this pattern and any other patterns that have a really loose gauge, because you have that loose gauge, any like mistakes, bits where you fudged it, where you're joining in the yarn if you're not really careful, those things show up because you've not got like the density of the fabric to kind of mask your mistakes more, or anything that's a little bit less than perfect. Those spots are going to show up more. So there's a few spots on this one where I think you can see where I was joining in the yarn. That's certainly true on my first one. Again, I will have photos here to illustrate what I'm talking about. But mistakes will show up. So I think I've spoken already about how this is a quick knit, and that's one of its selling points. But it shouldn't be just because it's stockinette in the round and just because it's fast. I think if I could go back and change how I knit this, I wouldn't have been quite so mindless about it, because the fabric is not forgiving of those little slip-ups. And that's just something to be aware of if you're going into making a garment that has this kind of gauge. For example, when I made my recent California sweater, which is inspired by this pattern, I was much more mindful about how I was joining in the yarn, for example, and being really meticulous about making sure that that wasn't going to show up in a way that I didn't find pleasant. And then also, as you get kind of stretching over time, as the garment and the fabric naturally changes and moves. Let's see if I can show this. You almost get like kind of a laddering effect because of how the garment's kind of stretched away, or the fabric's kind of stretched out. It doesn't bother me so much, but again, I think it just adds to that feeling that it doesn't look quite as polished as some other garments may look. So that open fabric, again, it's not so forgiving. So that's just I guess the change I'm saying I would make is I would just take a little bit more care with the knitting of it, and just something to be aware of if you are going into making this project or one that has a similar kind of style. When we look at the fabric 1 year in, so we're moving on to this yarn now and the fabric, how is this holding up 1 year in? So I just talked about the fact that there has been some stretching out over the past year. That's kind of common with knit garments, like the weight of the fabric hanging on your body, gravity is going to kind of pull it out. I'll be honest, I haven't reblocked this recently. I don't tend to overwash my sweaters. You may or may not know this, but you do not have to wash your 100% wool sweaters every time you wear them. It hasn't been washed and reblocked in a while, so that could help with some of the fabric issues, but full disclosure, I haven't done that recently. So it has kind of bagged out a little bit over the past year. And then the other thing I was looking at is, like, I do have some pilling. It's not like egregious. Let's see. You can see some pilling there. It's not, and there's like a little bit at the underarm. There's a bit more along the arms, which, you know, you would expect. Let's see if that will focus. So, you know, there's some pilling. I haven't taken my D-pillar to this recently. My experience of working with Surrey and Merino actually is because they're soft, they are going to pill. But it's not horrendous. It's not anything that's out of the ordinary. I could just take my fabric shaver to it and tidy it up a bit. This does still, the alpaca the Surrey is a hairy fiber. It does still shed a fair amount. So if I'm wearing it over a t-shirt, the t-shirt is going to get fluffy. That doesn't bother me, but it may bother some people. So that's just something to note. So yeah, I think that I'd say the yarn and the fabric is holding up pretty well, or as expected. No real complaints there. When I think about the combination of the Surrey and the Merino, and when I think about the color of this a year in, I love this combination of yarn. I love how soft it is. I love its warmth. I think it's a really lovely combo. the Sorella is just like, oh, such a gorgeous suri. I love the way that this is a really subtle variation, and I think that's because I use the suri as the variegated yarn rather than the merino. I love that it's like almost like watercolor-esque, like it's not very prominent, the variation. And obviously I also did alternate the skeins, so I didn't get any big areas of pooling, but I just really like the way this came out. Sometimes I'm not always sure how to fit this into my wardrobe color-wise, but yeah, I think the colors work for me. Like I think it's okay. And again, I'll add in some pictures that the lighting here isn't the best today, and it's very gray outside. And anyway, but I think overall I'm happy with the fabric and how it's performing and how it fits in my wardrobe. Okay, so we've gone through its wearability, how the fabric's holding up. So let's get to my final thoughts. Would I knit another of these? I've already knit 2, so obviously I enjoy making the pattern, and I enjoy the finished object mostly. I don't think I would knit another at this stage. I'm not saying never, but I think 2 is enough. And if at some point I maybe retire that first one I made that does have even more significant problems than this one, maybe I would consider making a replacement. But I have to say, having just recently made the California sweater, I think I like that drop shoulder construction more. So I think I'm more likely to make a second California sweater than I am to make a third Lento. But obviously I have already knit it more than once, and that's an endorsement of its own. I would also knit it as a gift, actually, saying that, because of it's the fact that it's not yarn hungry and the fact that it's fast, it would make a good gift knit. So that's actually quite a thought. So that is something that is possible and that I would do. And then would I recommend this pattern? My answer is yes, but with a caveat. So I think that this can seem really appealing to a beginner knitter. And again, I made this after a slow knitting period in my life, and as one of the first adult garments I was making once I was getting back into knitting. And the appeal that I'd heard when it had been hyped around is it doesn't use that much of materials, so it's cheaper. It's fast, and it's obviously a really easy construction. It's a top-down, in the round raglan. There's not a lot that's complicated here. So that felt very appealing. But because of what I've just been speaking about in terms of the unforgiving nature of this open gauge, I don't think I would actually recommend this as your first sweater project, unless you're going to take my words to heart and really be mindful as you're making this. I think personally you'd be better off doing something at a more standard gauge with a denser fabric, honing your sweater making skills, and then making this. With my California sweater, because I had this experience and I'd made more sweaters of different types as well between when this was knit and when I made my California sweater, I went into it with a lot more experience and knowledge about what I was doing. So I would say, even though it does not take intermediate knitting skills, I would be more likely to recommend it to somebody who has a couple of sweaters at least under their belt. That may go against what you've heard elsewhere, and everyone is entitled to their opinion. That's just my thinking on this one. So take from that what you will. But yes, I do recommend the pattern. It is a lot of fun to make. There is the enjoyment of getting something on and off your needles quickly. So I highly endorse it from that point of view, but maybe not if this is your first ever sweater that you're making. All right, we have reached the end of this episode of Well Worn, my review of the Lento sweater. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this time. I'd love to hear below, have you made the Lento sweater? Did you have a similar experience to me? Do you have differing views? Like, throw them in the comments down below. Would love to know your thoughts as well. If you enjoyed this episode, give me a like, and potentially hit that subscribe button so that you can come back here when I post new content. I really appreciate any of those likes and subscribes. It really does help me grow this channel, and I appreciate it. So until the next time, take care, happy knitting, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.